This CEO hated children and avoided them at all costs. But when a homeless girl showed him her family drawing, he broke down crying. What did she draw that made a heartless millionaire fall to his knees sobbing? The mahogany doors of Blackwell Industries swung open with the force of a man who owned the world. Marcus Blackwell, 32 years old and worth more than most small countries, strode through the marble lobby like a predator surveying his territory. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing the fear that rippled through every employee who dared to look up from their desks. "Sir, the board is ready for the quarterly meeting," whispered his assistant, Sarah. Her voice barely audible as she struggled to match his relentless pace. Marcus didn't acknowledge her words. He never did. In his mind, people were merely tools useful until they weren't, then discarded without a second thought. Today's agenda was simple. Cut costs by eliminating 200 positions. 200 families would lose their income. Before lunch, and Marcus felt nothing but satisfaction at the efficiency of it all. The elevator ascended to the 50th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below. From this height, people looked like ants, insignificant, disposable, beneath his notice. This was exactly how Marcus preferred to see the world. "Gentlemen," Marcus announced as he entered the boardroom, not bothering with pleasantries. "Today, we separate the wheat from the chaff. 200 employees will be terminated by 5 o'clock. No exceptions, no negotiations." The room fell silent. Even these powerful men, accustomed to difficult decisions, shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. But Marcus felt nothing. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was luxury he couldn't afford. Hours later, as rain began to pelt the windows of his corner office, Marcus watched the first waves of terminated employees emerge from the building below. Some cried, others argued with security, but most simply walked away in stunned silence, carrying their belongings in cardboard boxes. His phone buzzed with a text from his secretary. "Mr. Blackwell, there are some homeless children near the main entrance again. Should I call security to remove them?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He despised these street children, most of all their dirty faces, their pleading eyes, their pathetic attempts to garner sympathy from his employees. They represented everything he had worked to rise above: weakness, dependency, failure. "Remove them immediately," he typed back, "and increase security patrols. I don't want to see them near my building again." As the afternoon storm intensified, Marcus gathered his coat and briefcase. Another successful day of business, another step toward the empire he was building. He had no family, no friends, no attachments exactly as he preferred it. Relationships were liabilities, emotions were weaknesses, and compassion was a luxury only fools could afford. The elevator descended toward the lobby, carrying Marcus toward what he believed would be just another evening in his perfectly controlled, emotionally sterile world. But sometimes, the universe has other plans. The rain was relentless as Marcus pushed through the revolving doors of Blackwell Industries. The October storm had turned the sidewalks into rivers, and the wind whipped through the downtown canyon of skyscrapers with bitter intensity. He pulled his charcoal wool coat tighter, irritated that his driver was running late. That's when he saw her, a small figure huddled against the marble pillar of his building, so tiny she might have been invisible to anyone not looking directly at her. The child couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with vibrant red hair braided into 2 neat plaits, despite her obviously homeless condition. Her dress was a faded red with tiny white flowers, soaked through, but somehow still maintaining an air of dignity. Marcus felt his familiar surge of disgust. Security had failed him again. These parasites always found ways to slip past his defenses, like cockroaches seeking shelter from the storm. But as he approached, preparing to call security himself, the little girl looked up. her green eyes startlingly bright against her. Pale, rain-streaked face locked onto his with an intensity that made him pause. "Marcus?" she whispered, her small voice barely audible above the rain. He froze. No one called him by his first name except. But that was impossible. That was 7 years ago, a lifetime ago, a mistake he'd buried so deep it might as well have never happened. The child struggled to her feet, clutching something against her chest. A piece of paper, crumpled and damp, but held with the reverence of a precious treasure. "Marcus Blackwell?" she asked again, stepping closer despite the intimidating figure he cut in his expensive suit. "How do you know my name?" The words came out harsher than intended, but the girl didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a radiant expression that seemed to illuminate her entire face despite the gray, stormy afternoon. "Because you're my daddy." The world tilted. Marcus felt as though the sidewalk had opened beneath his feet, sending him tumbling into an abyss he thought he'd sealed forever. "What did you say?" With trembling hands, the little girl unfolded her paper. It was a drawing made with broken crayons on what looked like a piece of cardboard, crude, but unmistakably depicting a family. A tall man in a dark suit standing next to a woman with red hair, and between them, a small girl with the same fiery locks. At the bottom, in careful, childish letters, were the words, "My daddy Marcus. Mommy told me all about you before she went to heaven." The girl continued, her voice steady despite the tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "She said you were very important and very busy, but that someday I should find you and show you this picture. She said you'd remember her. Elena Morrison." Elena. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Suddenly, he was 25 again, ambitious and ruthless, but not yet completely heartless. Elena with her copper hair and infectious laugh. Elena who believed he could be better than he was. Elena who had loved him despite all his flaws. Elena who had stood in his office 7 years ago with tears streaming down her face, telling him she was pregnant. Elena who he'd offered money to take care of the problem. Elena who he'd abandoned when she refused to destroy their child. "No," Marcus whispered, but even as the word left his lips, he saw it, the unmistakable shape of Elena's eyes, the determined set of her chin, the way she tilted her head when she spoke. This child was his daughter. His daughter. "My name is Ruby," she said softly, as if introducing herself to someone she'd always known she'd meet. "Ruby Morrison. Mommy said I have your eyes when I'm thinking really hard about something." The drawing fluttered in the wind, and Marcus found himself reaching for it with hands that shook. The moment his fingers touched the damp cardboard, something inside his chest, something he'd thought was dead and buried, cracked, open like ice in spring. For the first time in over 20 years, Marcus Blackwell collapsed to his knees and wept. The rain continued to pour as Marcus knelt on the cold sidewalk, his expensive suit soaking through, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Ruby stood quietly beside him, her small hand tentatively reaching out to touch his shoulder with the gentle wisdom that only children possess. "Don't cry, Daddy," she whispered. "Mommy said you might be sad when you remembered us." Marcus looked up at this child, his child, and saw Elena's compassionate spirit shining through those familiar green eyes. The memories he'd buried came flooding back with devastating clarity. 7 years ago, Elena Morrison had been the bright spot in his increasingly dark world. She worked as a curator at the city's art museum, passionate about bringing beauty to others' lives. Marcus had met her at a charity gala he'd attended purely for business connections. But Elena had seen something in him that others missed, or perhaps something he'd lost since then. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be," Elena had told him. On their third date, running her fingers through his hair as they sat in his penthouse overlooking the city. There's warmth in you, Marcus. I can feel it. For 6 months, Elena had been his sanctuary. She'd cook simple meals in her tiny apartment, fill his life with laughter and art and hope. She'd talk about the future, their future, with such certainty that Marcus almost believed he could be the man she saw in him. But when Elena had appeared in his office that gray February morning, her face glowing with nervous excitement, everything changed. "Marcus, I have wonderful news," she'd said, her hands protective over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The words had hit him like shards of ice. A baby meant responsibility, commitment, vulnerability. It meant someone depending on him, needing him, potentially disappointing him the way everyone else had. Most terrifying of all, it meant the possibility of becoming like his own father, a man who'd abandoned his family when success called. "Get rid of it," Marcus had said coldly, his voice devoid of the warmth Elena had worked so hard to nurture. "I'll pay whatever it costs." Problem solved. Elena's face had gone white. Problem? Our baby is a problem? "I'm not ready for this." Marcus had continued, already retreating behind the walls he'd built around his heart. "I won't be tied down by some accident. Take the money and handle it. This isn't an accident, Marcus. This is love creating life." Elena's voice had broken, but her resolve remained strong. "I'm keeping our baby, with or without you." "Then it's without me," Marcus had replied, turning back to his computer as if she'd already ceased to exist. "Don't contact me again." Now, looking at Ruby's innocent face, Marcus felt the full weight of that moment crushing down on him. Elena had carried their child alone, raised her alone, and apparently died alone, all because he'd been too cowardly to embrace love when it was offered. "What happened to your mommy?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. Ruby's small fingers tightened around her precious drawing. "She got very sick last winter. The doctors said her heart just stopped working one day. But before she went to heaven, she told me to be brave and find you when I was ready. And where have you been living?" "Aunt Sarah took care of me after. Mommy died, but she went to heaven too last month. The people at the big building with lots of kids couldn't keep me because I kept asking about you." Ruby's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the fear beneath her brave facade. "I've been looking for you for weeks. I knew your name and where you worked because Mommy showed me pictures in the newspapers." Marcus stared at this remarkable child who'd survived more loss and hardship in her 7 years than he'd ever allowed himself to feel. She stood there in the rain, homeless and alone, yet still radiating the same gentle strength he'd fallen in love with in her mother. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words scraping against his throat like broken glass. "I'm so sorry, Ruby." Ruby stepped closer, and with the natural instinct of a daughter, wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. "It's okay, Daddy. Mommy said you were just scared. But she said when you were ready, you'd love me as much as she did." For the second time in 20 years, Marcus Blackwell wept this time for the woman he'd lost and the daughter he'd never known, he'd always wanted. "You're coming home with me," Marcus said, the words leaving his mouth before his rational mind could stop them. He stood slowly, his knees protesting against the cold concrete, and looked down at Ruby's upturned face. The little girl's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Really? To your house?" Marcus nodded, though terror was creeping up his spine. What did he know about children? About being a father? His own childhood had been a masterclass in emotional neglect, and he'd spent the last decade perfecting the art of avoiding human connection. But looking at Ruby soaked, shivering, and still clutching that precious drawing, he knew he couldn't walk away again. "James!" Marcus barked into his phone as his driver finally appeared through the rain. "Change of plans. We're taking Miss Ruby home." James, a veteran driver who'd worked for Marcus for 5 years, without seeing him show emotion toward anyone. Nearly dropped his keys when he saw his boss gently helping a small, bedraggled child into the back of the Mercedes. The ride to Marcus's penthouse was surreal. Ruby sat quietly beside him, her small hands folded in her lap, occasionally stealing glances around the luxurious interior. She'd never been in a car this expensive, Marcus realized. She'd probably never been in any car much at all. "Are you hungry?" Marcus asked awkwardly, the question feeling foreign on his tongue. Ruby nodded. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. There was a nice lady at the coffee shop who gave me half a muffin." The casual mention of a 7-year-old going without food for over 24 hours hit Marcus like a physical blow. While he'd been firing employees and calculating profit margins, his daughter had been begging for scraps. The elevator to his penthouse seemed to take forever. Ruby stood close to him, her wet hair leaving damp spots on his coat, but Marcus found himself oddly comforted by her presence rather than annoyed. When the doors opened to reveal his stark, modern apartment, Ruby gasped. "It's like a palace," she whispered, stepping carefully onto the polished marble floors, as if afraid she might break something. Marcus saw his home through her eyes. All sharp angles and cold surfaces, expensive art that no one ever looked at, furniture that prioritized appearance over comfort. It was the home of a man who'd never expected to share it with anyone, especially not a child. "Would you like something to eat?" Marcus asked, leading her toward the kitchen he rarely used. Ruby nodded eagerly, following him into the gleaming space filled with appliances he'd never touched. Marcus opened the massive refrigerator and stared at its contents. Takeout containers from expensive restaurants, imported wine, and virtually nothing a child would want to eat. I don't really cook," Marcus admitted, feeling foolish. "I usually have food delivered." "That's okay," Ruby said, climbing onto one of the high stools at the marble island. "Mommy taught me to make peanut butter sandwiches. Do you have peanut butter?" Marcus searched through cabinets he'd never opened, finding nothing but expensive coffee and specialty items his housekeeper occasionally stocked. No peanut butter, no bread, no anything a normal family would have. "I'll order something," he said, pulling out his phone. While they waited for food, Ruby explored the living room with careful steps, touching nothing but observing everything. She paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, her breath fogging the glass. "You can see everything from up here," she said softly. "Even the park where I used to sleep sometimes." The casual mention of his daughter sleeping in parks while he lived in luxury above the clouds made Marcus's chest tighten with guilt. How many nights had she been cold and frightened while he slept in his king-size bed, completely oblivious to her existence? When the food arrived, simple items hastily ordered from a family restaurant, Marcus watched Ruby eat with the careful politeness of a child who'd learned not to take food for granted. She finished every bite, even the vegetables she clearly didn't enjoy. "Where will I sleep?" Ruby asked as the evening grew later, her small voice betraying the exhaustion she'd been hiding. Marcus realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. His guest room was more of a display space than an actual bedroom, and his own room was hardly suitable for a child. But Ruby was already drooping with fatigue, her brave facade finally cracking to reveal the scared, tired little girl beneath. "In my room tonight," Marcus decided. "Tomorrow we'll figure out something better." As Ruby curled up in his enormous bed, nearly disappearing among the designer pillows, Marcus sat in the chair beside her, watching this small person who'd already turned his world upside down. She fell asleep clutching her drawing, and for the first time in years, Marcus found himself wondering what kind of father he could possibly become. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside his penthouse, something had fundamentally shifted. For better or worse, Marcus Blackwell was no longer alone. The next morning arrived with chaos Marcus had never experienced. He woke to soft, heartbreaking sobs that cut through him like a knife. Ruby sat on the edge of his massive bed, her small frame shaking as tears streamed down her face. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, panic flooding his system. He had no idea how to comfort a crying child. "I had a bad dream about Mommy," Ruby whispered. "She was calling for me, but I couldn't find her." Marcus stood frozen, watching his daughter's pain and feeling completely helpless. Elena would have known what to do. Any normal parent would know what to do. But Marcus had built his life around avoiding emotional situations. It's okay," he said awkwardly, sitting on the bed but maintaining distance. "It was just a dream." Ruby looked at him with those piercing green eyes, and Marcus realized his response had been cold, clinical, the same tone he used in board meetings. This was his child. Not a business problem to solve. Breakfast was another disaster. Marcus had ordered groceries delivered, but staring at the ingredients in his kitchen, he had no idea how to prepare anything a 7-year-old would eat. When he attempted to make toast, he burned it black. When he tried scrambled eggs, they turned into rubber. Ruby watched quietly, her stomach rumbling audibly. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, throwing the ruined eggs into the trash. "I don't know what I'm doing." "It's okay, Daddy," Ruby said softly. "Maybe we could have cereal?" The word Daddy still hit him like electricity every time she said it. Marcus poured cereal into bowls, adding milk and feeling like he'd accomplished something monumental until he realized the milk was nearly expired. "I have to go to work," Marcus announced after breakfast, the familiar pull of his routine calling. To him, "Mrs. Patterson from next door can watch you." Ruby's face fell. "You're leaving?" "It's just for a few hours," Marcus said, though even as he spoke, he could see the fear in her eyes. This child had been abandoned by everyone she'd ever loved. To her, his leaving for work probably felt like another rejection. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor, was kind but clearly overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility. Marcus left detailed instructions and tried to ignore the way Ruby watched him leave, with tears threatening to spill over at the office. Marcus couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, he found himself calling to check on Ruby. Was she eating? Was she scared? Did she understand he was coming back? His assistant Sarah noticed immediately. "Sir, you've canceled 3 meetings this morning," she said carefully. "The Henderson acquisition review has been postponed twice." Marcus stared at the contracts on his desk, deals that would have consumed his attention completely just 2 days ago, and felt nothing but anxiety about a little girl in his apartment. "Reschedule everything for tomorrow," he said impulsively. "Everything?" Sarah's eyes widened. Marcus had never postponed business for anything. Everything. When Marcus returned home 3 hours early, he found Ruby sitting on his couch, surrounded by crayons and paper. She'd been drawing again, pictures of houses with gardens, families holding hands, children playing in parks. All the things she'd never had but dreamed about. "You came back," she said, her relief so evident it broke his heart. "Of course I came back," Marcus replied, though he was beginning to understand why she might have doubted it. "What are you drawing?" Ruby held up a picture of 2 figures standing in front of a house with flowers. "It's us, after we get a real home with a yard where I can play." Marcus studied the drawing, noting that she'd drawn him smiling, something he rarely did in real life. In Ruby's imagination, he was already the father she needed him to be. The question was whether he could actually become that man. The following weeks brought small miracles disguised as ordinary moments. Marcus found himself learning the intricate language of fatherhood, a vocabulary he'd never thought he'd need to master. It started with bedtime stories. The first night Ruby asked him to read to her, Marcus had stared blankly at the children's books his assistant had hurriedly purchased. He'd never read a bedtime story in his life, had never been read to as a child. But Ruby climbed into his lap with such trust that Marcus found himself stumbling through tales of brave princesses and talking animals, his deep voice gradually softening with each page. "You have a nice reading voice, Daddy," Ruby said sleepily, her head resting against his chest. "Mommy used to say stories are like hugs for your mind." Marcus felt something warm unfold in his chest. Elena's wisdom lived on in their daughter. Gentle reminders of the woman who'd seen goodness in him when he couldn't see it himself. Thunder became another teacher. During Ruby's second week with him, a fierce storm rolled through the city. Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports when he heard her crying from the guest room he'd hastily converted into her bedroom. He found her huddled under covers, trembling with each crack of thunder. "I'm scared," she whispered when she saw him. "The loud noises remind me of the night Mommy went to heaven." Without thinking, Marcus climbed into the small bed and pulled Ruby close. "It's just weather," he said gently, surprising himself with his patience. "The thunder can't hurt you." "I won't let anything hurt you." They spent the rest of the storm together, Marcus telling her about how thunder was just the sky's way of applauding the lightning's beauty, a whimsical explanation that made Ruby giggle and helped her fall asleep in his arms. Work began to feel different, too. Ruby had started spending afternoons in his home office while he conducted video meetings, quietly drawing at a small table he'd had delivered. During one particularly tense negotiation with overseas partners, Ruby had wandered over and handed him a drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "For good luck, Daddy," she'd whispered. Marcus had found himself smiling genuinely for the first time during a business call in years. The other executives noticed the change in his demeanor, less aggressive, more collaborative. Deals that might have ended in cold ultimatums now concluded with handshakes and mutual respect. "Sir," Sarah observed one afternoon, "you seem different lately, happier." Marcus looked up from Ruby's latest masterpiece, a family portrait where she'd drawn him with an enormous smile and hearts floating around his head. "I suppose I am," he admitted. The transformation was most evident in small rituals they'd begun to create together. Saturday morning pancakes, where Ruby stood on her stepstool, helping by adding chocolate chips in heart shapes. Sunday afternoon walks in Central Park, where Ruby would point out interesting clouds, and Marcus would find himself actually seeing them instead of thinking about. Monday's meetings. Ruby had also started helping with his work in ways that amazed him. During one video conference about employee relations, she'd quietly suggested they put more happy colors in the office because happy colors make people want to work better. Marcus had actually passed the suggestion to his facilities team, and the resulting workplace improvements had boosted morale significantly. "You're very smart," Marcus told her one evening as they sat together on his couch. Ruby curled against his side while he read through contracts. "Mommy said I got my smart from you and my heart from her," Ruby replied, looking up at him with Elena's eyes. "She said that made me perfect." Marcus set aside his papers, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago, and focused entirely on his daughter. "Your mother was right," he said softly. "You are perfect." As Ruby drifted off to sleep against his shoulder, Marcus realized he was experiencing something completely foreign: contentment. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next step up the ladder of success. He was simply grateful to be exactly where he was holding his daughter, building a life that finally felt like home. Ruby had a way of seeing magic in places Marcus had walked past for years without noticing. It started on a Tuesday morning when she pressed her face against the car window during their ride to his office and gasped with delight. "Look, Daddy, the pigeons are having a meeting." Marcus followed her pointing finger to see a group of pigeons gathered around a park bench, pecking at crumbs left by an elderly man. Where Marcus had always seen nuisances that dirtied his building's entrance, Ruby saw a community gathering for breakfast. "Can we feed them sometime?" Ruby asked, her eyes bright with possibility. "Pigeons carry diseases," Marcus replied automatically, then caught himself. When had he become so afraid of life? "But I suppose we could bring some bread this weekend." Ruby's resulting smile was so radiant that Marcus made a mental note to stop at the bakery on Saturday. The transformation continued during their weekend walks. Ruby would stop to examine every flower pushing through sidewalk cracks, marveling at their determination to grow in impossible places. She'd wave at babies in strollers, compliment elderly ladies on their hats, and somehow manage to make even grumpy New Yorkers smile back at her. "Why does everyone look so sad when they're walking?" Ruby asked one Sunday afternoon as they strolled through Central Park. Marcus looked around, really seeing the faces of passers-by for the first time. She was right. Most people hurried by with expressions of stress, frustration, or simple exhaustion. When had he started looking like that too? "I think they've forgotten how to notice beautiful things," Marcus said slowly. "Like you do," Ruby nodded sagely. "Mommy said grown-ups sometimes need kids to remind them how to see with happy eyes." That afternoon, Ruby insisted they visit the playground. Marcus sat on a bench, initially uncomfortable among the other parents, but gradually found himself drawn into conversations sparked by Ruby's natural friendliness. She befriended children from all backgrounds, sharing her crayons and including shy kids in games with the instinctive kindness Helena had nurtured in her. "Your daughter is remarkable," said another father, watching Ruby help a younger child down the slide. "She has such a generous spirit." Marcus felt a surge of pride so intense it surprised him. "She gets that from her mother," he said softly. The most profound moment came when Ruby introduced him to her friends from before, homeless individuals she'd encountered during her weeks on the streets. Marcus's first instinct was protective concern, but Ruby approached a woman named Dorothy with such genuine affection that he found himself listening to their stories instead of hurrying away. "Ruby used to share her food with my cat," Dorothy explained, her weathered face soft with fondness, "even when she barely had enough for herself. Said Whiskers looked hungrier than she did." Marcus stared at his 7-year-old daughter, who'd shown more compassion during her brief time on the streets than he'd demonstrated in 32 years of privileged living. The shame was overwhelming, but so was the inspiration. That week, Marcus quietly established a trust fund for homeless services, making the donation anonymously, but telling Ruby about it during one of their bedtime story sessions. "Really?" Ruby's eyes went wide. "So Dorothy and Whiskers won't be cold this winter?" "Really," Marcus confirmed, smoothing her red hair. "What you taught me about helping people was more valuable than any business lesson I've ever learned." Ruby's influence began affecting his work relationships too. During a particularly heated board meeting about layoffs, Marcus found himself asking a question that stunned everyone present. What if, instead of cutting jobs, we invested in training programs to help these employees grow with the company? The suggestion came directly from Ruby's perspective. She'd asked him the previous evening why companies threw people away instead of helping them become better, the same way she helped struggling kids at the playground. His executives initially resisted, but Marcus pushed forward with the training initiative. The results exceeded all projections. Employee loyalty increased, productivity soared, and the company's reputation shifted from ruthless efficiency to innovative leadership. "Sir," Sarah mentioned during their weekly review, "there's been talk in the industry about Blackwell Industries' new approach to human resources. People are calling it revolutionary." Marcus smiled, thinking of Ruby's simple wisdom about treating people with kindness. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the most innocent sources. That evening, as he tucked Ruby into bed, She handed him her latest drawing, a picture of him sitting at his desk, but instead of the stern expression he usually wore, she'd drawn him with kind eyes and a gentle smile, surrounded by happy stick figures representing his employees. "This is how I see you now, Daddy," Ruby said. "Not scary anymore, just good." Looking at the drawing, Marcus realized Ruby hadn't just changed how he saw the world. She'd changed how the world saw him, and most importantly, how he saw himself. Richard Blackwell studied his nephew across the mahogany desk, disturbed by what he saw. The cold, calculating Marcus he'd helped shape over the years had been replaced by someone softer, distracted, someone who smiled at text messages from a 7-year-old. "You're making a mistake," Richard said, swirling his whiskey. "This sudden domesticity doesn't suit you, Marcus." Marcus looked up from Ruby's latest drawing. "What doesn't suit me is this conversation, Uncle Richard." Victoria Blackwell leaned forward with manufactured concern. "Darling, the board is whispering about your distraction, your reputation." "My daughter is not a distraction," Marcus interrupted firmly. "She's my priority." Richard and Victoria exchanged a look, the calculating glance they'd perfected over 20 years of marriage and manipulation. They'd been positioning themselves as Marcus's heirs since his parents died, carefully cultivating their role as his only family. Ruby's arrival threatened everything. What Marcus didn't know was that they'd been aware of Ruby for months. Their contacts in social services had alerted them when Elena died, when Ruby was placed with her aunt, and again when that aunt died. They'd orchestrated Ruby's previous failed attempts to reach Marcus through bribes to security and strategic misinformation. "We kept her away before," Victoria had told Richard during their planning sessions. "A few well-placed payments, some lies about her identity, and she was just another street child to be removed." But Ruby's determination and a crayon drawing had undone months of careful sabotage. "Marcus," Richard continued patronizingly, "you're not thinking clearly. This girl appears with a convenient story, and you just accept she's yours?" "She has Elena's eyes," Marcus said quietly. "Her expressions, her spirit. I know she's mine." "DNA tests can be arranged," Victoria suggested smoothly. "And even if she is your daughter, you're hardly equipped to raise a child. Your lifestyle, your work demands, it's not fair to either of you." Marcus studied these people who'd guided him since childhood, who'd always seemed to have his interests at heart. For the first time, he noticed the hunger in their eyes when they surveyed his penthouse, cataloging possessions like future inheritances. "You seem suddenly concerned about my happiness," Marcus observed. "When has that ever mattered to you?" Richard's mask slipped momentarily, revealing something cold beneath. "We've always cared about your welfare." But Marcus was remembering conversations differently now. How Richard had discouraged his relationships, especially with Elena. How Victoria had praised his workaholic isolation, encouraging him to build wealth while remaining emotionally disconnected. How they'd seemed pleased when he described breaking up with Elena years ago. "Where were you when Elena died?" Marcus asked suddenly. "What?" Victoria blinked, startled. "Elena Morrison, Ruby's mother. She died 6 months ago. Where were you?" "Marcus, how would we know about your former relationship?" Richard recovered quickly, but Marcus was analyzing their micro-expressions with skills that had built his empire. Victoria's eye tension, Richard's tightening grip on his glass, these were practiced liars caught off guard. "This conversation is over." Marcus stood. "Ruby will be home soon, and I promise to help build her dollhouse." After they left, Marcus watched their car disappear into traffic. The protective instincts of fatherhood were awakening something he'd thought buried, not the destructive paranoia that had isolated him from love, but the fierce vigilance of a parent sensing danger. He called his security chief. "James? I need comprehensive background checks on Richard and Victoria Blackwell. Everything. I want to know exactly where they were and what they were doing in the 6 months before Ruby found me. Ruby had taught him to see with kinder eyes, but Marcus hadn't. Forgotten how to recognize predators. And anyone threatening his daughter would rediscover exactly how ruthless he could be when protecting what mattered most. The campaign against Marcus and Ruby began subtly, with surgical precision designed to appear like unfortunate coincidences. Richard and Victoria understood that direct confrontation would only strengthen Marcus's protective instincts. "We need to make him doubt himself," Victoria explained as they plotted in their Park Avenue apartment. "Show him he's not equipped to be a father." Victoria began calling mutual acquaintances, planting seeds about Marcus's sudden personality change. She spoke with practiced worry to Margaret Ashford, a prominent society matron whose opinions carried weight. "I'm so worried about dear Marcus," she confided. "He's completely changed since this girl appeared, canceling meetings, making impulsive decisions. It's so unlike him." Richard worked different angles, spreading doubts about Ruby's paternity through carefully placed conversations. "We all hope she's truly his," he would say with feigned concern. "But you know how desperate some people can be." The psychological warfare escalated with arranged accidents. A mysterious gas leak requiring building evacuation while Ruby slept. Food poisoning at a restaurant Marcus chose, affecting only Ruby's meal. A malfunctioning elevator trapping them. For hours, terrifying Ruby and making Marcus feel helpless. Each incident reinforced the narrative that Marcus attracted danger to his daughter's life. Victoria would call afterward with false sympathy, suggesting Ruby needed a more traditional family environment. "These things keep happening around you, Marcus," Victoria said after the elevator incident. "Perhaps the universe is trying to tell you something." They targeted Ruby directly, with subtle psychological manipulation. Victoria would accidentally encounter them, making comments designed to create uncertainty. "Your daddy seems so tired lately, sweetie," Victoria would say sadly. "Taking care of you must be very hard for him. I bet he misses his old life sometimes." Richard made seemingly innocent observations. "Your daddy never had children before. Ruby, he doesn't know how to be a father. That must be scary sometimes." The most insidious attacks involved Marcus's business relationships. Richard suggested to board members that Marcus's family situation was affecting his judgment. He highlighted decisions where Marcus chose compassionate approaches over purely profitable ones, questioning whether the company's soft policies showed wise leadership or emotional instability. The Marcus we knew would never have implemented employee welfare programs, Richard told the board privately. "I'm concerned his judgment has been compromised." Victoria organized social events, showcasing her stability while highlighting Marcus's absence. "Poor Marcus can't join us," she would explain. "He's dealing with family complications. I do worry about him." They hired investigators to dig into Elena's past, searching for anything damaging. Finding nothing, they began fabricating small inconsistencies in Ruby's story, then pointing them out with concerned questions. "I've been thinking about what Ruby said about her aunt," Victoria mentioned casually. "The timeline doesn't quite add up, does it?" The cumulative effect was designed to make Marcus question everything: his parenting abilities, Ruby's truthfulness, even his own mental state. Each doubt was planted with surgical precision, wrapped in loving concern and family loyalty. But they underestimated the bond between Marcus and Ruby. Every attempt to undermine their relationship only made Marcus more protective, more determined to shield his daughter. Ruby, with the intuitive wisdom of a child who'd survived loss, began sensing malevolent presence circling their happiness. She started drawing troubled pictures, dark figures, lurking at edges of bright family scenes, storm clouds gathering over sunny houses. The war for Marcus's soul and Ruby's future had begun in earnest, fought in shadows and whispers. With the highest stakes imaginable, the security report landed on Marcus's desk like a bomb. 3 weeks of investigation had uncovered a web of deceit that made his blood run cold. Richard and Victoria's financial records showed payments to private investigators, bribes to building security, and suspicious cash withdrawals that coincided perfectly with every accident that had befallen Ruby. Sir James, his head of security, pointed to highlighted sections. They've been tracking Alana Morrison since her death. They knew about Ruby's existence and actively prevented her from reaching you for months. Marcus studied the evidence with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers. Phone records showing calls to social services, bank transfers to a security guard who'd been fired for losing Ruby's messages, even surveillance footage of Victoria speaking to Ruby outside his building weeks before their emotional reunion. They've been planning this for years, Marcus realized, his voice deadly quiet, waiting for me to die alone so they could inherit everything. But Marcus wasn't the same man he'd been 3 months ago. Ruby had taught him that strength came not from isolation, but from protecting what mattered most. He began building his defenses with military precision. First, he legally adopted Ruby through an expedited process, using his influence and connections to ensure ironclad documentation. The adoption papers were signed on a sunny Tuesday morning, with Ruby sitting on his lap, carefully writing her new name, Ruby Morrison Blackwell. "Now you're officially mine forever," Marcus told her, signing his own name with a flourish. "I was always yours, Daddy," Ruby replied, hugging him tight. "But now the paper says so too." Next, Marcus restructured his entire estate. He established multiple trust funds for Ruby's education, healthcare, and future needs, all managed by independent trustees who had no connection to Richard and Victoria. He updated his will, ensuring that even if something happened to him, Ruby would be financially secure and legally protected. The business transformation was equally dramatic. Inspired by Ruby's compassionate worldview, Marcus implemented sweeping changes at Blackwell Industries. He created comprehensive employee welfare programs, established partnerships with homeless shelters, and launched an initiative providing job training for at-risk youth. "Sir, these programs are actually increasing productivity and employee loyalty," Sarah reported during their weekly review. "The board is calling it revolutionary leadership." Marcus smiled, remembering Ruby's simple wisdom about treating people with kindness. Sometimes the best business strategy is just being human. He also assembled a legal team specializing in family law and corporate defense. If Richard and Victoria wanted to fight, Marcus would be ready with every weapon at his disposal. His lawyers began preparing preemptive documentation protecting Ruby from any future custody challenges. The physical security upgrades were comprehensive. Marcus hired a discreet but thorough personal protection team, installed state-of-the-art security systems, and moved from his vulnerable penthouse to a secure townhouse with a garden where Ruby could play safely. "I like our new house better," Ruby announced, twirling in the sunlit living room. "It feels more like a family house." Marcus had chosen the property specifically because it felt warm and welcoming, nothing like the cold, modern spaces he'd preferred before Ruby changed his perspective on what constituted a home. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus began building a support network. He connected with other single parents, established relationships with Ruby's teachers and pediatrician, and created a community of people who knew and cared about his daughter. If Richard and Victoria tried to isolate them, they would fail. During one particularly meaningful conversation with Dr. Sarah Chun, Ruby's new pediatrician, Marcus felt validation for his transformation. "Ruby is one of the most well-adjusted children I've seen," Dr. Chun told him. "Whatever you're doing as a father, it's working beautifully. She feels secure, loved, and confident." The final piece of Marcus's defensive strategy was transparency. He began documenting everything: Ruby's happiness, her progress in school, their daily routines, the stable home environment he'd created. If anyone questioned his fitness as a father, he would have overwhelming evidence of Ruby's well-being. 3 months after that rainy day, when Ruby had first called him Daddy, Marcus felt genuinely prepared for whatever Richard and Victoria might attempt. He'd learned that true power wasn't about crushing enemies. It was about building something so strong and good that attacks couldn't penetrate it. As he tucked Ruby into bed that night, reading her favorite story about a brave princess who saved her kingdom through kindness, Marcus realized he'd become the father Ruby deserved, and the man Elena had always believed he could be. The courthouse steps felt like a battlefield as Marcus climbed them, Ruby's small hand clasped tightly in his. Today would determine everything, whether he could keep his daughter or whether Richard and Victoria's manipulation would succeed. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Ruby whispered. "A little," Marcus admitted, kneeling to meet her eyes. "But I'm not scared of losing you, because that's never going to happen. I promise." Inside the family court, Richard and Victoria sat with their expensive legal team, projecting respectable concern. They'd crafted their case carefully. Marcus was an unstable workaholic who'd undergone a dramatic personality change, potentially suffering from a mental breakdown. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney began, "we're genuinely concerned about this child's welfare. Mr. Marcus Blackwell has demonstrated erratic behavior since taking custody of Ruby Morrison." They presented fabricated evidence methodically. Marcus's career changes were painted as professional instability. His compassionate business policies were characterized as poor judgment. The accidents they'd orchestrated were presented as evidence Ruby wasn't safe in his care. This man went from firing 200 employees without emotion to implementing costly welfare programs overnight. The attorney continued. He's canceled important meetings, made impulsive decisions, and seems unable to maintain consistent environment a traumatized child needs. Victoria took the stand with practiced tears, describing her deep concern. "He's never been around children, Your Honor. Ruby has been through trauma, losing her mother, living on streets. She needs stability, routine, the structured environment Richard and I can provide while Marcus gets help." Richard followed, painting himself as the concerned family member. "I've watched my nephew struggle with relationships his entire adult life. His parents died when he was young, and he never learned healthy emotional attachment. Now he's projecting unresolved trauma onto this little girl." Their witnesses were carefully selected business associates, testifying about Marcus's changed demeanor, child psychologists speaking about stability importance, even the bribed security guard claiming Marcus seemed obsessed and unstable. Marcus's attorney, Patricia Reynolds, was a formidable family law specialist who'd seen every manipulation tactic. She began dismantling their case piece by piece. "Your Honor, what Mr. Richard Blackwell calls instability, I call growth." "What?" "He terms erratic behavior. I call a man learning to put his daughter's needs first. These changes aren't evidence of mental breakdown. They're evidence of a father discovering his priorities." She presented Marcus's evidence, Dr. Chun's glowing reports about Ruby's emotional health, documentation of stable home environment, testimonials from teachers about Ruby's happiness, and financial records showing responsible planning for Ruby's future. "This isn't about a man having a breakdown," Patricia continued. "This is about a father who transformed his entire life to become the parent his daughter needed. The results speak for themselves. Ruby is thriving." The most damaging moment came when Patricia introduced security investigation findings. Bank records showing suspicious payments, phone logs revealing coordination to keep Ruby from Marcus, and surveillance footage of staged encounters. "Your Honor, Mr. Richard and Mrs. Victoria Blackwell, didn't just fail to help this child find her father. They actively prevented it. They orchestrated the very accidents they're now using as evidence against Mr. Marcus Blackwell's fitness. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. What appeared to be concerned family intervention was revealed as calculated conspiracy. To maintain control over Marcus's inheritance, Ruby sat quietly throughout most proceedings, but when the judge asked if she wanted to speak, she stood with courage that had carried her through months of homelessness. "I love my daddy," she said, simply, her clear voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "He takes care of me, reads me stories, and makes me feel safe. Before I found him, the mean man and lady told me he didn't want me, but they were lying." The judge studied evidence, testimonies, and the obvious bond between Marcus and Ruby. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "This court finds no evidence that Mr. Marcus Blackwell is unfit as a parent. The petition for emergency custody transfer is denied." The courtroom victory felt hollow to Marcus as he watched Richard and Victoria's faces contort with barely concealed rage. He knew this wasn't over-desperate people made dangerous moves, and they'd already proven how far they were willing to go to destroy his relationship with Ruby. That evening, as they celebrated quietly at home with Ruby's favorite pizza, she seemed unusually thoughtful. She sat curled against Marcus on their couch, absently coloring while he read through legal documents Patricia had given him. "Daddy," Ruby said suddenly, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. "The mean lady and man, they talked to me before." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ruby's small fingers twisted the crayon nervously. "Before I found you, when I was looking for your building, the lady with the shiny hair, she gave me candy and told me you were very busy and didn't want little girls bothering you." The protective fury that rose in Marcus's chest was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "Tell me everything, Ruby. It's very important." With the innocent honesty of a child, Ruby began recounting encounters that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. Victoria approaching her near food trucks, offering treats while planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's interest in having a daughter. Richard intercepting her attempts to enter the building, telling security she was just another beggar child, making up stories. "The man said you were mean to children and would call the police if I bothered you," Ruby continued, her voice small. He began building his defenses with military precision. First, he legally adopted Ruby through an expedited process, using his influence and connections to ensure ironclad documentation. The adoption papers were signed on a sunny Tuesday morning, with Ruby sitting on his lap, carefully writing her new name, Ruby Morrison Blackwell. "Now you're officially mine forever," Marcus told her, signing his own name with a flourish. "I was always yours, Daddy," Ruby replied, hugging him tight. "But now the paper says so too." Next, Marcus restructured his entire estate. He established multiple trust funds for Ruby's education, healthcare, and future needs, all managed by independent trustees who had no connection to Richard and Victoria. He updated his will, ensuring that even if something happened to him, Ruby would be financially secure and legally protected. The business transformation was equally dramatic. Inspired by Ruby's compassionate worldview, Marcus implemented sweeping changes at Blackwell Industries. He created comprehensive employee welfare programs, established partnerships with homeless shelters, and launched an initiative providing job training for at-risk youth. "Sir, these programs are actually increasing productivity and employee loyalty," Sarah reported during their weekly review. "The board is calling it revolutionary leadership." Marcus smiled, remembering Ruby's simple wisdom about treating people with kindness. Sometimes the best business strategy is just being human. He also assembled a legal team specializing in family law and corporate defense. If Richard and Victoria wanted to fight, Marcus would be ready with every weapon at his disposal. His lawyers began preparing preemptive documentation protecting Ruby from any future custody challenges. The physical security upgrades were comprehensive. Marcus hired a discreet but thorough personal protection team, installed state-of-the-art security systems, and moved from his vulnerable penthouse to a secure townhouse with a garden where Ruby could play safely. "I like our new house better," Ruby announced, twirling in the sunlit living room. "It feels more like a family house." Marcus had chosen the property specifically because it felt warm and welcoming, nothing like the cold, modern spaces he'd preferred before Ruby changed his perspective on what constituted a home. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus began building a support network. He connected with other single parents, established relationships with Ruby's teachers and pediatrician, and created a community of people who knew and cared about his daughter. If Richard and Victoria tried to isolate them, they would fail. During one particularly meaningful conversation with Dr. Sarah Chun, Ruby's new pediatrician, Marcus felt validation for his transformation. "Ruby is one of the most well-adjusted children I've seen," Dr. Chun told him. "Whatever you're doing as a father, it's working beautifully. She feels secure, loved, and confident." The final piece of Marcus's defensive strategy was transparency. He began documenting everything: Ruby's happiness, her progress in school, their daily routines, the stable home environment he'd created. If anyone questioned his fitness as a father, he would have overwhelming evidence of Ruby's well-being. 3 months after that rainy day, when Ruby had first called him Daddy, Marcus felt genuinely prepared for whatever Richard and Victoria might attempt. He'd learned that true power wasn't about crushing enemies. It was about building something so strong and good that attacks couldn't penetrate it. As he tucked Ruby into bed that night, reading her favorite story about a brave princess who saved her kingdom through kindness, Marcus realized he'd become the father Ruby deserved, and the man Elena had always believed he could be. The courthouse steps felt like a battlefield as Marcus climbed them, Ruby's small hand clasped tightly in his. Today would determine everything, whether he could keep his daughter or whether Richard and Victoria's manipulation would succeed. "Are you scared, Daddy?" Ruby whispered. "A little," Marcus admitted, kneeling to meet her eyes. "But I'm not scared of losing you, because that's never going to happen. I promise." Inside the family court, Richard and Victoria sat with their expensive legal team, projecting respectable concern. They'd crafted their case carefully. Marcus was an unstable workaholic who'd undergone a dramatic personality change, potentially suffering from a mental breakdown. "Your Honor," Richard's attorney began, "we're genuinely concerned about this child's welfare. Mr. Marcus Blackwell has demonstrated erratic behavior since taking custody of Ruby Morrison." They presented fabricated evidence methodically. Marcus's career changes were painted as professional instability. His compassionate business policies were characterized as poor judgment. The accidents they'd orchestrated were presented as evidence Ruby wasn't safe in his care. This man went from firing 200 employees without emotion to implementing costly welfare programs overnight. The attorney continued. He's canceled important meetings, made impulsive decisions, and seems unable to maintain consistent environment a traumatized child needs. Victoria took the stand with practiced tears, describing her deep concern. He's never been around children, Your Honor. Ruby has been through trauma, losing her mother, living on streets. She needs stability, routine, the structured environment Richard and I can provide while Marcus gets help. Richard followed, painting himself as the concerned family member. I've watched my nephew struggle with relationships his entire adult life. His parents died when he was young, and he never learned healthy emotional attachment. Now he's projecting unresolved trauma onto this little girl. Their witnesses were carefully selected business associates, testifying about Marcus's changed demeanor, child psychologists speaking about stability importance. Even the bribed security guard claiming Marcus seemed obsessed and unstable. Marcus's attorney, Patricia Reynolds, was a formidable family law specialist who'd seen every manipulation tactic. She began dismantling their case piece by piece. Your Honor, what Mr. Richard Blackwell calls instability, I call growth. What? He terms erratic behavior. I call a man learning to put his daughter's needs first. These changes aren't evidence of mental breakdown. They're evidence of a father discovering his priorities. She presented Marcus's evidence, Dr. Chun's glowing reports about Ruby's emotional health, documentation of stable home environment, testimonials from teachers about Ruby's happiness, and financial records showing responsible planning for Ruby's future. This isn't about a man having a breakdown, Patricia continued. This is about a father who transformed his entire life to become the parent his daughter needed. The results speak for themselves. Ruby is thriving. The most damaging moment came when Patricia introduced security investigation findings. Bank records showing suspicious payments, phone logs revealing coordination to keep Ruby from Marcus, and surveillance footage of staged encounters. Your Honor, Mr. Richard and Mrs. Victoria Blackwell didn't just fail to help this child find her father. They actively prevented it. They orchestrated the very accidents they're now using as evidence against Mr. Marcus Blackwell's fitness. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically. What appeared to be concerned family intervention was revealed as calculated conspiracy. To maintain control over Marcus's inheritance, Ruby sat quietly throughout most proceedings, but when the judge asked if she wanted to speak, she stood with courage that had carried her through months of homelessness. I love my daddy, she said, simply, her clear voice carrying across the silent courtroom. He takes care of me, reads me stories, and makes me feel safe. Before I found him, the mean man and lady told me he didn't want me, but they were lying. The judge studied evidence, testimonies, and the obvious bond between Marcus and Ruby. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. This court finds no evidence that Mr. Marcus Blackwell is unfit as a parent. The petition for emergency custody transfer is denied. The courtroom victory felt hollow to Marcus as he watched Richard and Victoria's faces contort with barely concealed rage. He knew this wasn't over-desperate people made dangerous moves, and they'd already proven how far they were willing to go to destroy his relationship with Ruby. That evening, as they celebrated quietly at home with Ruby's favorite pizza, she seemed unusually thoughtful. She sat curled against Marcus on their couch, absently coloring while he read through legal documents Patricia had given him. Daddy, Ruby said suddenly, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. The mean lady and man, they talked to me before. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. What do you mean, sweetheart? Ruby's small fingers twisted the crayon nervously. Before I found you, when I was looking for your building, the lady with the shiny hair, she gave me candy and told me you were very busy and didn't want little girls bothering you. The protective fury that rose in Marcus's chest was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Tell me everything, Ruby. It's very important. With the innocent honesty of a child, Ruby began recounting encounters that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. Victoria approaching her near food trucks, offering treats while planting seeds of doubt about Marcus's interest in having a daughter. Richard intercepting her attempts to enter the building, telling security she was just another beggar child, making up stories. The man said you were mean to children and would call the police if I bothered you, Ruby continued, her voice small. Compassionate 8-year-old who approached life with Alana's warmth and Marcus's determination. Teachers praised her academics, but celebrated her kindness toward classmates and natural leadership more. Ruby helped a new student today. Mrs. Davidson called one afternoon. She gave up recess to show him around and introduce him to friends. Such a generous heart. Every evening, Marcus marveled at their life. Ruby did homework at the kitchen table while he cooked dinner, chattering about her day, friends, dreams. These ordinary moments felt more precious than any business triumph. Bedtime remained Marcus's favorite time. Ruby would brush teeth, put on star-covered pajamas, and climb into her princess bed for stories. Instead of fairy tales, she preferred hearing about Elena, how she'd loved art museums, laughed at terrible jokes, believed in everyone's goodness. "Do you think Mommy is proud of us?" Ruby asked one night, snuggled against his side. "I know she is," Marcus replied softly. "She's proud of the amazing girl you've become, and maybe proud that I finally learned to be the man she always believed I could be." Their new life wasn't perfect, but it was real, filled with love and laughter and quiet contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Marcus had traded his empire of ice for a kingdom of warmth, and he'd never made a better deal. 2 years after that rainy afternoon, when a small girl with a crumpled drawing had shattered his world and rebuilt it with love, Marcus found himself in Central Park on a perfect September morning, watching Ruby blow out 8 candles on a birthday cake shared with 20 children from the local homeless shelter. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Marcus encouraged, his arm around her shoulders as she closed her eyes tight. Her face scrunched in concentration. Ruby opened her eyes and smiled up at him with Elena's radiant warmth. "I wish that other kids could find their families like I found you, Daddy." The birthday party had been Ruby's idea, not a celebration at some expensive venue, but a picnic in the park for children who rarely experienced such joy. Marcus watched as Ruby moved between her guests, ensuring everyone felt included, sharing her gifts freely, embodying the compassion that had transformed not just his life, but his entire understanding of what success truly meant. "She's remarkable," said Margaret Chun, the shelter director, as they watched Ruby teaching a shy 5-year-old how to blow bubbles. "The way she connects with these children. It's like she understands their hearts." Marcus nodded, his chest tight, with pride and love. "She survived what they're surviving. She remembers what it feels like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be told you don't matter." The past year had brought profound changes beyond their personal happiness. Blackwell Industries had become a beacon of ethical business practices, leading the industry in employee satisfaction and community impact. Marcus's transformation from ruthless CEO to compassionate leader had inspired other executives to reconsider their own approaches to success, but the most meaningful change was standing right in front of him, teaching a group of children how to make friendship bracelets with the patience of someone who'd learned that small acts of kindness could change everything. As the afternoon wound down and the shelter children reluctantly prepared to leave, each carrying bags of leftover cake and small gifts Ruby had insisted on providing, she approached Marcus with her latest drawing. "This is for you, Daddy," she said, handing him a picture that made his breath catch in his throat. The drawing showed 3 figures under a rainbow: a tall man, a small girl with red hair, and a woman with wings watching over them both. At the bottom, in Ruby's careful handwriting, were the words, "My perfect family, forever and always." "Do you think Mommy can see us?" Ruby asked, leaning against his side as they watched the last of their guests disappear into the distance. Marcus looked down at his daughter, this miraculous child who taught him that love wasn't weakness, but the greatest strength of all. That vulnerability wasn't failure, but the foundation of genuine connection. That success meant nothing without someone to share it with. "I know she can," Marcus said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know she's proud of the incredible person you're becoming, just like I am." Ruby smiled and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his. "Come on, Daddy. Let's go home and make dinner together. I want to tell you about the book I'm reading." As they walked through the park together, father and daughter, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man who believed power came from isolation, that emotions were liabilities, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now he understood that everything he'd thought made him strong had actually made him weak, and everything he'd feared would destroy him had given him the only life worth living. Ruby skipped beside him, chattering about her friends, her dreams, her plans for helping other children find their way home. Her laughter echoed through the trees, a sound more beautiful than any profit report, more valuable than any acquisition, more precious than all the wealth in the world. Marcus Blackwell had lost his empire of ice and found his kingdom of love. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd finally made the best deal of his life.